Back, boxing fans. Once again, this troll who got my channel closed down consistently still only makes his content based on what I say. I had a whole live today full of tons of content, even talked about the fact that the PBC, for financial reasons, might just want to have Errol Spence face Fundura for the WBC title and Tim Tszyu versus Bud Crawford to help build up the rematch between Crawford and Spence. Does that sound like hate to you? Obviously, I was saying that I don't think Errol Spence at this point deserves an opportunity for a world title fight, but I didn't let that stop me from looking at the reality of the situation. So that's the difference between me, a boxing fan, and these racist narrative-driven channels. Of course, you can see by his image what he's telling you. His image tells you everything. With him, it's all about race, comparing Errol Spence to Lomachenko. Lomachenko is a three-weight world champion. Errol Spence isn't. Lomachenko beat way more world champions than Errol Spence did. Lomachenko is just a far more proven fighter than Errol Spence. I mean, you can be a fanboy of Errol Spence all you want, that's fine. But making it racial, it just exposes you once again. The reality of the situation is comparing Lomachenko's controversial loss to Devin Haney, an undisputed champion, to Errol Spence's ass-kicking to Bud Crawford is downright ridiculous. People literally said that Errol Spence should retire after he got destroyed against Bud Crawford. Nobody was telling Lomachenko to retire after his controversial loss to Devin Haney. Right? If anything, people were more revigorated on Lomachenko and how he's got a big part in the 135-pound division. For Errol Spence, people were saying that at this point, it might be better for him just to retire. He's got nothing else to prove, and he just might suffer injuries moving forward if he continues in his, in this path, this profession of his. But of course, with John, it's not about boxing. It's always about race.
Into a live, all right? I was on the anti-black boxing community's, I was listening to his live. Maybe the first 5 minutes of it,
You're listening to the first 5 minutes of my live, right? So why are you listening? If you hate and disparage literally everything that I said. The irony is you're the one who literally came out and criticized Tim Tszyu post-fight, right? For getting beat. So you're going to criticize Tim Tszyu for getting beat by majority decision, but then you want to hype up Errol Spence coming off of a knockout loss, right? People, I think even you, were critical of Fundura for getting a world title fight coming off of a knockout loss. Most of us felt that, he shouldn't be getting a title fight coming off of a knockout loss. But because he's a replacement opponent, people understood that, oh, he's probably the only guy available and ready. Ericson Luben just came out in an interview yesterday saying that he wasn't ready. It was too short a period of time for him to prepare. So that's why Fundura obviously had this. But as far as him fighting the Russian fighter for the WBC title, people were really upset about that. They really didn't understand how this guy coming off of a knockout loss deserved to be put into a world title fight, right? But yet, now here you are talking about Errol Spence and comparing him to Lomachenko fighting Kambosos, right? And trying to compare these two situations. I mean, one guy just won a world title. With Kambosos, he doesn't have a title. Neither does Lomachenko. It's a vacant title.
It was typical. Black people this, black people that. The PBC is bad for boxing. The same stuff.
I didn't say the PBC is bad for boxing. I just say what's happening with the PBC is expected. They're looking at trying to push for pay-per-view fights, which is why they pushed Errol Spence into the ring with Fundura post-fight, even though Fundura and Tim Tszyu have a rematch clause. But if you were to watch that fight and post-fight, you would never think there was a rematch clause. The way it was ignored, the way Errol Spence was calling out Fundura, and they were prepping up that fight. Even Tim Tszyu, after losing, he called Bud Crawford, which only echoes what I'm saying. Don't be surprised if those two fighters fight for the WBC and WBO title separately, giving Spence and Crawford the opportunity to build up the rematch, which obviously was already contracted and was a fight people expected. Am I hating the PBC? No, this makes good business. I understand why they're doing it. But once again, here's the PBC pushing for pay-per-view fights and reusing fighters more than building up new fighters, more than showcasing more fighters, more than putting on free boxing, right? This is consistently what they do.
That he's been preaching for over, 10 years, okay? But
well, the PBC hasn't been around for 10 years, so that's impossible.
He tried to shame the PBC for a potential matchup between Errol Spence and Sebastian Fundora. Now, Errol Spence got no...
Listen to him. Like, always the same bullshit from this dude, right? It's ridiculous. Like, I'm just telling you, nobody is asking for Errol Spence versus Fundora. Errol Spence putting his name in the hat created more controversy than fanboyism, because most people saw what Bud Crawford did by petitioning the WBO to become the mandatory. What Errol Spence did is basically capping. But yet, which is the guy that was at fight night tonight that was allowed to go into the ring? Errol Spence. Typical PBC. Because the man that actually has a mandatory fight is Bud Crawford. The guy that has a rematch clause is actually Tim Tszyu. So how does Errol Spence even come into this conversation except for the PBC trying to jam him into this conversation to give him an opportunity to build himself back up so they can put him back to the position where they once had him?
Right. And basically called out Sebastian Fundora, and that kind of surprised me. And I'm thinking to myself, what? You sure you want that, Spence? Because we just saw what happened to you when you fought Terence Crawford. That's what I was thinking in the back of my mind. But if you want it...
And that's what everybody's thinking. And when you say you want it, just because you want something doesn't mean you get it. You also have Ericson Luben, who deserves an opportunity above Errol Spence, right? There's quite a few people in position to get that fight that aren't named Errol Spence. But we understand why the PBC is pushing this, because they're more interested in making pay-per-views. Having Errol Spence and Fundora in Texas on pay-per-view for them makes more sense than the options. That's all I was pointing out. But then I also talked about how it made sense. I can understand why they're doing it, even if I don't agree with it.
They didn't have it. I'm not against that fight. I would rather see Terence Crawford get his opportunity before...
See, let's just put this in context. He called Kambosos and Lomachenko a shit show. He ridiculed and criticized and downplayed that fight, ripping Lomachenko for cherry-picking Kambosos. But yet, he has no problem with Errol Spence fighting Fundora. I mean, Errol Spence, the last time we saw him, literally looked like he got hit by a fucking truck. So this is, again, the consistent double standard you see from a guy like John Boxing. Whereas Lomachenko fights for a vacant title, he gets criticized and shit on. Shakur does it, and it's not a big deal. Tank Davis gets elevated and then fights a guy who hasn't fought a top 10 of competition, and all of a sudden it's pay-per-view worthy and it's the best thing ever. Lopez fights a top guy that people said beat Lomachenko, and he's cherry-picking and it's a shit fight, right? Like, you see the consistency. When a black fighter does something, it's paraded and fucking cheered for by John Boxing. But when a non-black fighter does something, it's criticized and ridiculed and hated on. And then, of course, the race narrative is pushed out, even though, why does it even apply? In this case, why are you even comparing Lomachenko to fucking Errol Spence? Lomachenko has never been knocked out.
Errol Spence, because Errol Spence, was coming off a loss, right? But again, when it comes to boxing politics, the PBC is always shamed, right? The PBC's...
Listen to that. Because we know with the PBC, it's about fucking politics. Literally, they fucking held Bud Crawford out of PBC contention fights for over 5 years. That was the PBC that did that, right? So you can't change it. You can't try to massage it into not being the way it is. When everybody sees this and everyone comments on it, there must be some truth to it, don't you think? Even the LDBC is now critical of the PBC with regards to Tank Davis and how he's being protected and not fighting the opposition that they think he should be fighting. This is the LDBC. This is John's favorite crew of YouTubers. And even they're critical of the PBC and what they're doing, and primarily with regards to Tank Davis, because they're, of course, Dick Riding, Devin Haney. So it's Errol Spence, Bud Crawford situation all over again.
Always shamed for doing everything in-house. And that's what the anti-black boxing fan was trying to shame the PBC for. Terence...
Actually, I never mentioned in-house at all, because literally all of those guys are in-house. And a lot of them are coming off of victories. Some of them have mandatory rematches, and some of them actually, well, not officially tied together with the PBC, are actually affiliated with the PBC. Just had their last fight with the PBC and was just calling out a PBC fighter in Bud Crawford. So all these guys are affiliated with the PBC. Luben, Sebastian Funduro, Tim Zhu, Errol Spence, and Bud Crawford.
Crawford is not a PBC fighter.
See, the stupidity with this is neither is Boots Ennis, but yet we still know he's tied together with the PBC. If I'm not mistaken, literally Bud Crawford had a rematch clause with Errol Spence with the PBC. There was a 2-fight deal with the PBC. Yes, that fell through because Errol Spence obviously wasn't ready for that rematch. But doesn't this make more sense? I'm not hating on it. I get it. But my point is, I would prefer Funduro to not fight Errol Spence coming off of a fucking brutal knockout loss.
And so the PBC is going to do what's best for their fighters. Just like Top Rank is going to do what's best for their fighters. Just like DAZN or...
And you are heavily critical of Top Rank and DAZN and Matchroom and everybody else. So don't point fingers at me and say that I'm hating when you've consistently hated on every other promotional fucking company out there. And only Dick wrote Al Haymon. Why? Because he's black. Even though primarily he's fucking pushing Mexican, American, and Mexican fighters on his channel. Even this card today, check it out. How many Latino fighters were on this card? From the main event, you had Funduro. On the undercard, you had 2 Latino fighters. So out of the 4 top fighters on this pay-per-view card, 1 was white Australian, the other 3 were Latinos. And then you go down this card and there's just more of it. The Russian fighter Bolchak, fighting for the WBC interim title, fought Mendoza, another Latino fighter. So the card was Latino, Latino, Latino. But then John wants to act like people hate the PBC because it's pro-black. Yet the majority of fights they put on are Latino fighters, just like everybody else. So what are you talking about? It has nothing to do with Al Haymon's color. It has to do with the way this group, this promotional company is working. They got 3 fights fucking set up for the first half of 2024. And all 3 of them are pay-per-view. Only 3 cards, but all 3 of them are pay-per-view.
Excuse me, Matchroom is going to do what's best for their fighters. Terence Crawford is not a PBC fighter. Unfortunately, that is what's going to hold him back, in my opinion. That's what's going to hold Terence.
But how's that going to hold him back? See, this comes back to this whole stupidity with John and other people when they talk about how Canelo is ducking David Benavidez. He's mandatory, even though the fight was basically going to get mandated in March. He just moved up to 175. So Bud Crawford just petitioned the WBO to become the WBO mandatory. That fight is fucking gonna happen. The WBO don't play around. That's why there was controversy in the last few days about Tim Tszyu potentially dropping his WBO title. Now we see that, well, if he doesn't drop his title, Funduro will, because he's got the WBC title. So he don't need the WBO, and he don't need to be forced to fight Bud Crawford when he's got a fight with Errol Spence in Texas at the AT&T, right? And of course, if this happens, John will fucking act like it's the best thing ever, biggest pay-per-view in history. He'll be all over it. But yet, is it really the best fight to happen? Is it okay for Funduro to duck Bud Crawford once again because of in-house politics of the PBC? But he's making this about race. Yet Bud Crawford's black. Errol Spence is black. I don't see how any of this has anything to do with race, and I don't see how Lomachenko even gets pulled into this conversation. Oh, sorry, no, I do, because whenever it's John, it's always about race. But let me know what you think. Leave your comments in the comment section below. Do you think Errol Spence deserves an opportunity to fight for the WBC and potentially WBO title? Ironically enough, Bud Crawford just tweeted and said, sorry, big fish, you got to wait in line, right? Because he knows he's ahead of Spence in line because the WBO just mandated him as the WBO mandatory. And we know Tim Tszyu has a rematch clause. So in that sense, he also got to be behind Tim Tszyu as well. So that's two fighters that Errol Spence is behind. But do you really think that's going to matter? Do you think that's going to stop the PBC and Al Haymon from making the fight that they want, which is Errol Spence getting back in the ring against a Latino fighter? But leave your comments below. Thanks for watching. Peace out. Enjoy your weekend. I still don't know what this has to do with Lomachenko.